Welcome to the Velvet Murmurs, where every whisper hides a secret. I'm so glad you've joined us for today's mystery. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're listening or watching from. We'd love to hear from our fellow mystery lovers around the world. Miss Marple and the Sapphire Tide. Chapter 1. All aboard the Celestia Blue. There are few things in the world more unsettling, Miss Marple often reflected, than people in a hurry to relax. At the docks of Civitavecchia, beneath a Mediterranean sun that cast everything in dazzling white, holidaymakers bustled and jostled for position, weighed down by wide-brimmed hats, guidebooks, and the curious determination of those who had paid handsomely to be pampered. Porters in crisp navy uniforms darted to and fro, collecting trunks and trolleys. A brass band wheezed out an ambitious rendition of Rule, Britannia, from under a striped awning. Among the crowd, Miss Marple stood quite still, her gloved hands folded over the clasp of her handbag. She wore a pale grey linen dress and a straw hat pinned neatly into place. Her nephew, the novelist Raymond West, had insisted she accompany him on a 10-day Mediterranean cruise aboard the Celestia Blue, a ship whose brochure had promised old-world glamour with modern flair. To Jane Marple's mind, that sounded suspiciously like cocktails with umbrellas in them, but she had agreed nevertheless. She had never been to Greece, and at her age, one must accept invitations with grace. "It's marvellous, Aunt Jane," Raymond enthused, gesturing toward the ship's shining white hull. "You'll be utterly spoiled. They've got everything on board. A theatre, a spa, even a library with a fireplace. Just the thing to soothe a tired mind." Miss Marple gave a small, non-committal smile. "And what exactly, dear Raymond, is one supposed to do with a tired mind at sea?" "Why, absolutely nothing," he replied cheerfully. "That's the point." They boarded by ascending a broad gangway, greeted at the top by a steward with improbable cheekbones who offered them chilled towels and champagne flutes. Raymond accepted both. Miss Marple politely declined the latter. Once aboard, they were shown to their adjoining staterooms on the Riviera deck. Miss Marple's room was comfortable in an unnecessarily plush sort of way, with pale velvet upholstery, gold-rimmed mirrors, and a decanter of some mysterious amber liquid resting on a walnut sideboard. A bowl of white roses sat beneath the porthole. A small envelope rested against it, bearing the printed words, "Miss Jane Marple," with compliments from the Celestia Blue guest experience team. She opened it and found an itinerary. Welcome dinner at 7 o'clock in the Artemis dining salon, followed by a moonlight concert on the promenade deck. "Shall we explore?" Raymond asked, popping his head into her suite. "We've 2 hours before dinner." Miss Marple nodded. She changed her gloves and took her handbag. It never did to be unprepared. And together they made their way through the ship's many levels, each more extravagant than the last. There was a marble atrium with a spiral staircase, a gallery of paintings curated by contemporary maritime artists, and a sunlit lounge with floor-to-ceiling windows where guests sipped colourful drinks. The staff were attentive, bordering on intrusive, with polished accents that seemed borrowed from the BBC. On the promenade deck, a salt-sweet breeze whipped through the rails, and Miss Marple paused to admire the sea, which stretched endlessly, a flat expanse of sapphire blue. It was peaceful, deceptively so. By evening, the Celestia Blue had slipped from port, and the dining salon glittered like a chandeliered ballroom. Waiters moved with graceful efficiency, and the air was filled with the clink of silverware and low laughter. Raymond introduced Miss Marple to his companions. "This is Cordelia Vane, a tremendous talent on the West End, absolutely electric on stage." Cordelia, a striking woman with auburn hair, offered Miss Marple a limp, disinterested hand and returned to sipping her wine. Mrs. Delilah Fillmore, Raymond continued, nodding to an older woman in pearls who had a pet canary perched quite illegally on her shoulder. "I simply can't be without my Percival," Mrs. Fillmore said dreamily. "He gets terribly seasick, poor thing." "And this is Dr. Elias Brooke, expert on Greek antiquities. He's giving lectures on lost islands and ancient tides, aren't you?" Dr. Brooke bowed slightly. He was tall and skeletal, with a voice like dry paper. "I doubt the audience will last beyond Atlantis," he said. "And Mr. Thorne," Raymond finished, gesturing to a pale, angular man in a dove-grey suit. Mr. Thorne nodded once and gave a thin smile. He did not speak during the meal, but his eyes never left Cordelia. Miss Marple observed them all over her lemon tart. Just after the coffee was served, Cordelia stood abruptly. "I've a headache," she murmured, not meeting anyone's eye. She turned and walked away, her silk dress rustling like autumn leaves. Mr. Thorne waited precisely 30 seconds, then rose without a word and followed. "Ah," Miss Marple said quietly. Raymond looked up. "What's that?" "Only that young people are so rarely discreet when they wish to be." That night, as the ship cruised silently under a moonlit sky, Miss Marple retired to her suite. The sea hissed softly outside the porthole. She took out her embroidery, but her thoughts wandered. Something in Cordelia's expression at dinner, guarded brittle, had reminded her of something, or someone. Perhaps it was nothing. But Miss Marple had never believed in coincidence, nor in the innocence of sudden headaches. She had just folded her shawl when she noticed something unusual. Her embroidery kit, left zipped that morning, now lay slightly open. Resting inside it, tucked beside the scissors, was a folded scrap of paper she hadn't placed there. In careful, unfamiliar handwriting, it read, "The tides are quiet, but the waves remember." She took what wasn't hers. Chapter 2. A Death in the Moonlight. At 7 o'clock the following morning, the Celestia Blue drifted smoothly through an expanse of silver-blue sea, the sky pale with the promise of heat. Breakfast was served in the aft dining lounge, where white linen cloths fluttered gently in the breeze, and waiters moved with hushed efficiency. The scent of oranges and coffee hung in the air like a spell. Miss Marple, seated near the window, stirred her tea with careful precision. Across from her, Raymond scanned the ship's daily newsletter, The Blue Horizon. He had not yet mentioned the events of the night before, though his brow remained furrowed above his spectacles. "So," Miss Marple said lightly, "what does the news tell us today? Will we be serenaded with Greek ballads or lectured about Atlantis?" Raymond didn't answer immediately. Instead, he placed the newsletter down with unusual delicacy. "Cordelia's dead," he said at last. Miss Marple's expression did not change. "I know," she replied softly, "though I must admit I rather hoped I was wrong. They say she slipped, some sort of accident, fell from the upper deck sometime after midnight." He paused. "A steward found her by the rail. No witnesses. Mr. Thorne apparently raised the alarm when she didn't return to her cabin." "Ah, yes," Miss Marple said, selecting a corner of toast. "And how terribly attentive of him. I do wonder if he spent the rest of the night searching the ship." Raymond looked uncomfortable. "Aunt Jane, do you suppose something was amiss?" Miss Marple dabbed her lips. "I rarely suppose, dear, but I do notice. And I noticed last night a tension between them. He followed her from dinner, quite without subtlety, and she looked very much as though she had seen a ghost. Just then, a shadow passed across the deck. Dr. Elias Brooke approached, his long coat buttoned despite the heat. "Terrible thing," he murmured, pulling out a chair. "I heard she was found beneath the portside balustrade. Quite the drop, 20 feet or more." "Do you believe it was an accident, Doctor?" Miss Marple asked gently. He gave her a sideways look, thoughtful. "There are no cliffs at sea, Miss Marple, only edges." Raymond looked up. "You knew her well?" Brooke shook his head. "Only in the way people on ships know one another. Snippets, glimpses. She asked me, oddly enough, about ancient burial rites in the Aegean. Wanted to know if it was true that offerings were sometimes removed from tombs." "Removed?" Miss Marple repeated. He smiled faintly. "Stolen?" She was fascinated by stories of lost jewels and curses, like something out of a penny dreadful. "Or a play?" Miss Marple murmured. At that moment, a steward approached. "Excuse me, madam. Captain Rossetti has asked whether you would be willing to speak with him." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Me? How unusual." The steward bowed. "He understands you were one of the last people to see Miss Vane before her incident." Raymond touched her arm. "Shall I come with you?" Miss Marple smiled. "I hardly think I'm being arrested, dear. But do keep an ear open while I'm gone." Captain Rossetti's office was situated just below the bridge, a handsome, brass-trimmed room with shelves of navigational charts, a mahogany desk, and a painting of Poseidon above the barometer. The captain himself was a man in his late 50s, bronzed and formal, with piercing eyes and a voice like polished teak. "Miss Marple," he greeted her, gesturing toward a chair. "I understand you were seated at Miss Vane's table last night." "Yes," she replied. "And I must say I found her unsettled, restless even. She left early, followed, quite immediately, by Mr. Thorne." Captain Rossetti nodded. "We've spoken to Mr. Thorne. He says he wished to apologize for a private disagreement." "Did he mention what the disagreement was about?" The captain hesitated. "Number. But Miss Vane's personal effects contained no diary, no letters, only a compact mirror, 2 sachets of perfume, and a velvet pouch. The necklace she was wearing, the one found broken at the scene, was missing its central stone." Miss Marple looked up. "Really? I thought I saw a sapphire the size of a robin's egg last night." "As did others. The setting appears to have been prized open. The jewel is gone." Miss Marple folded her hands. "So we now have 2 oddities, a fall no one witnessed, and a stone no one can find." The captain tapped a pencil on his desk. "We also have a note. A steward discovered it on Miss Vane's dressing table this morning, folded into her travel journal." He handed it to her. In the same script as the one Miss Marple had found in her embroidery kit, it read, "You thought the sea would forget, but even the deep has eyes." Miss Marple inhaled, folding the note with care. "Captain, I don't mean to be impolite, but I believe someone aboard your ship is staging a performance, and it has nothing to do with leisure." Rossetti narrowed his gaze. "And you believe Cordelia Vane was murdered?" Miss Marple gave the faintest nod. "Yes, and I think the motive may not be jealousy, but history." As Miss Marple returned to her stateroom, she passed Mrs. Fillmore's open door. The widow stood at the threshold, peering fretfully down the corridor. "Oh, Miss Marple," she whispered. "You haven't seen my Percival, have you?" "Your bird?" Miss Marple paused. "No, I'm afraid not." "He flew out? Silly thing, I left the balcony open." Mrs. Fillmore's eyes shifted. "Though I did hear something last night, about 2 o'clock, just before the scream, a splash, something heavy, falling, not a bird." Miss Marple offered a gentle smile. "Did you mention that to the crew?" "Oh, no," said Mrs. Fillmore quickly. "People always think I'm imagining things, but I saw a shadow move across the promenade, and I heard footsteps, then splash." Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but in her mind a map was forming, a shadow, a scream, a missing jewel, and a woman who had asked about stolen offerings. It wasn't a play, it was a puzzle, and Miss Marple was already reaching for the corner pieces, Chapter 3. The Man in the Photograph. The midday sun hung lazily above the Celestia Blue, casting long shadows across the upper decks and turning the sea into a mosaic of blinding light and liquid cobalt. Passengers lingered by the pool, sipped iced drinks on deck chairs and murmured gossip beneath oversized sun hats. But within the cool hush of the ship's small onboard library, Miss Marple sat upright in a velvet armchair, her handbag resting on her lap, and her eyes fixed on a photograph she had just slipped from between the pages of a forgotten book. It had not been there by accident. The book was a thin travel volume on the history of the Aegean Isles, its spine cracked, its title long faded. Tucked between chapters on volcanic formations and ancient temples was a black and white snapshot, creased and curling at the edges, taken some 20 or 30 years prior. It showed a group of 6 individuals standing beside what appeared to be a whitewashed Greek chapel. They were dressed in expedition gear, sun hats, linen shirts, wide belts. At the center stood a striking woman with dark curls and a knowing smile. Cordelia Vane. There was no mistaking her. Miss Marple examined the others. 2 were unfamiliar, a portly man in glasses and a severe woman in a headscarf. But in the back row, half-shadowed beneath an olive tree, stood a man with deep-set eyes and a slight watchful build. Mr. Thorne. She rose quietly and approached the librarian, a young Frenchwoman who looked as though she spent most of her shifts rearranging the same 3 magazines. Miss Marple held out the photograph. "I wonder," she asked, "do you keep a record of who last borrowed this book?" The librarian blinked. "We don't normally check. There's no digital system. Just a sign-out sheet." She flipped through a small, spiral-bound logbook. "Ah, here we are. The book was borrowed 3 days ago by a Mr. Elias Brooke." Miss Marple found Dr. Brooke shortly after lunch, seated alone on the promenade deck, a pair of binoculars resting in his lap. He watched the horizon with the casual boredom of a man who'd spent too long studying stillness. "Miss Marple," he greeted without turning. "Care for some philosophical musing on tides and treachery?" "I'd prefer something less poetic," she replied gently, slipping into the chair beside him. "Perhaps the truth behind an old photograph." That caught his attention. She handed him the image. He held it carefully, as one might a fragile relic from a dig site. His eyes darkened. "I was wondering where this had gone," he murmured. "It's from the 1991 excavation at Kalos Limanas, off the coast of Rhodes. We were looking for submerged ruins, mythic stuff mostly. Cordelia was there. She wasn't an actress back then. She was a sponsor, funded the trip in exchange for, well, adventure." "And Mr. Thorne?" Brooke hesitated. "He wasn't called Thorne then. His name was Henry Wexley. He was an artifact handler, kept records, catalogued finds, very precise. But he was dismissed after something went missing." "What went missing?" Miss Marple asked, her voice barely above the sound of the waves. Brooke's eyes flickered. "A sapphire, the Kalos stone, blue as the sea, cut in the shape of an eye. Local legend said it was sacred, placed in the forehead of a sea god statue. Nonsense, really, but valuable. Cordelia wore it once, briefly, as a joke. And then it disappeared," Miss Marple said. "Yes. Cordelia said she returned it to the dig tent. Wexley, Mr. Thorne, claimed he never saw it again, accused her of taking it. She accused him. The trustees quietly shelved the matter. No charges, just embarrassment." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And now Cordelia is dead, and her necklace, which once held a large blue stone, is conveniently missing its center." Brooke met her gaze. "You think Wexley followed her onto this ship?" "I think he's been following her for years." They sat in silence for a moment, the sea whispering against the hull below them. "She was terrified yesterday," Brooke said quietly. "She asked me, out of nowhere, if you could really bury a secret at sea." Miss Marple stood. "I believe someone tried to, but the sea is rather poor at keeping secrets, Doctor. The tide always returns them to shore." Later that afternoon, a ship-wide announcement summoned passengers to the theatre for a scheduled lecture by Dr. Brooke. Miss Marple attended, slipping into a rear seat, her notebook folded discreetly in her bag. The lights dimmed, a projector hummed, and on the screen appeared a slide of the chapel from the photograph. Brooke's voice was calm, academic, detached. The chapel at Kalos Limenas is considered the most remote ecclesiastical structure in the Aegean. But beneath it, according to local oral tradition, are the remains of an older site predating Christian history, a pagan shrine, perhaps even a vault. Miss Marple's eyes were not on the screen. They were watching Mr. Thorne, who sat 3 rows ahead, his neck rigid, his hands clenched together in his lap. And beside, Chapter 4, The Second Disappearance. The Celestia Blue had dropped anchor that morning off the coast of Santorini, a picturesque interruption in an increasingly tense voyage. Passengers were invited to take small tenders ashore for wine tastings and photographs. Miss Marple, however, remained aboard. She had woken unusually early, restless, alert, as if her mind had risen before her body. The latest anonymous note still sat on her dresser, its folds damp with Mediterranean humidity. "I should never have taken it. But I didn't kill her. Please believe me." Someone aboard was frightened, and someone aboard was closing in. Miss Marple took her tea in the observation lounge, a quiet, glass-walled haven where only the truly early or the truly anxious gathered. It was there she spotted Mrs. Fillmore again. The widow was seated alone, her pale fingers wrapped around a teacup, her usual lipstick untouched. On the table beside her, a small bird cage sat covered in dark linen. "No Percival this morning?" Miss Marple asked, approaching softly. Mrs. Fillmore jumped slightly. "Oh, Miss Marple! Number he's not well." Miss Marple sat down gently. "Birds are curious creatures. They sense things before we do. Silence is often a warning." Mrs. Fillmore hesitated, then leaned in. "You think it wasn't an accident, don't you?" Miss Marple nodded. "Cordelia Vane died in the dead of night, her sapphire stone prized from its setting. That stone had a long history, I gather, one steeped in jealousy, perhaps in betrayal." Mrs. Fillmore's eyes brimmed. "I didn't kill her. I didn't say you did. But I knew something was wrong. She told me she was being followed. She said the past had come aboard with her. And then that man, Mr. Thorne, he cornered her near the spa the day before she died. She said he asked if she still had it." "What did she reply?" "I couldn't hear, but she looked cornered. I followed her back to her cabin. She dropped something in the corridor. A ring, not valuable looking, just a brass thing, almost antique." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "May I see it?" Mrs. Fillmore hesitated, then opened her handbag and retrieved a folded handkerchief. Inside was the ring, thick, crude, and unmistakably ancient, engraved with what looked like waves and an open eye. Miss Marple's voice dropped. "This isn't a ring for wearing, it's a token, a marker, a warning perhaps." "But I found it," Mrs. Fillmore whispered. "Not Cordelia. I picked it up. And since then I feel like someone's watching me." That afternoon, as the sun reached its brightest point, a shrill commotion erupted near the portside staircase. 2 stewards and a cabin attendant were shouting, calling for someone. For Mr. Thorne. He had failed to show for lunch, for his scheduled yoga class, and for his standing appointment with the ship's tailor. His cabin was empty. Miss Marple arrived just in time to see Captain Rossetti unlocking Mr. Thorne's door with a brass key. The room was immaculate, a single suitcase by the wardrobe, a jacket folded on the armchair. On the bedside table, strangely, sat a pair of opera glasses, a book on underwater archaeology, and a silver pen. But no sign of Thorn, and no sign of struggle. "He can't have vanished," said one of the stewards, flustered. "There's nowhere to go. We've not reached port yet." But Miss Marple, standing in the doorway, felt a familiar chill. "He's not vanished," she said quietly. "He's hidden, or he's been hidden." The ship was searched. Crew quarters, storage rooms, the gymnasium, even the lifeboats were inspected. Nothing. By sunset, whispers had bloomed across every corridor. First a woman dead, now a man missing. A black pearl had reportedly disappeared from a display in the boutique. A painting in the corridor outside the gallery now hung ever so slightly crooked. Miss Marple walked the deck as the stars came out, her thoughts racing. Thorn, if that was even his real name, had a history with Cordelia. A history involving a stolen artifact, a ruined reputation, and what Dr. Brooke called the Kalos Stone. And now he, too, was gone. She found herself again at the library. It was empty. The photograph still lay where she'd tucked it earlier, behind the same battered Aegean travel book. But something new had been added, a yellow post-it note in fresh handwriting. It wasn't him. He wanted it back, but he didn't kill for it. Not yet. The sea remembers. Ask the doctor what really happened in 91. Miss Marple read the words twice. Then she turned and made her way directly to Doctor Brooke's stateroom. He answered in his shirt sleeves, surprised but calm. "Miss Marple? We need to speak," she said firmly. "And I believe this time you should start at the beginning." Brooke stepped aside, letting her in. His room was starkly neat, a bottle of brandy on the desk, an old diving knife displayed in a frame on the wall, and a chart of Kalos Limenas with certain points marked in red ink. "The Kalos stone wasn't just a myth, was it?" Miss Marple asked. "Cordelia took it. Thorn tried to retrieve it, and you—" "I buried it," Brooke interrupted softly. "After the dig collapsed, we'd argued. There were too many eyes on us. Cordelia wanted to smuggle it out. I said no, so I took it to the sea myself, dropped it down a reef trench." "But Cordelia still wore a sapphire last night," Miss Marple said. "Which suggests she retrieved it." Brooke met her gaze. "Not necessarily." Chapter 5. A Stone for the Drowned. Miss Marple sat across from Dr. Elias Brooke in the dim glow of his stateroom, the thrum of the ship's engines vibrating faintly beneath their feet. Outside the porthole, moonlight struck the Aegean waves like scattered mercury. Inside, silence grew thick as Brooke's words hung in the air. "Cordelia didn't retrieve the sapphire." Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap. "And yet she was wearing something remarkably like it the night she died." Brooke nodded, almost mournfully. "It was a replica. She had it made years ago. I saw the original before I let it fall into the trench. It was darker, heavier. The stone she wore was brilliant, but glass. A decoy, perhaps." "To what end?" he sighed. "Cordelia had many admirers and a few enemies. Over the years, I think she began to enjoy the drama, the idea that someone might believe she still had it, that they might follow her. She lived as though she were on stage, always halfway into a costume. I sometimes wondered if she was waiting to be caught." Miss Marple's gaze drifted briefly to the diving knife on the wall. "And Mr. Thorn?" "I believe he came aboard intending to confront her, perhaps to demand the truth, but I don't think he killed her. That isn't how he operates. He's methodical, not impulsive." "And yet he's vanished," she said softly. "And someone is planting notes, watching, manipulating." Brooke hesitated, then crossed the room. From a drawer beneath his charts, he removed a sealed envelope. "She gave this to me the day before she died," he said, Told me to open it only if something happened to her. Miss Marple opened the flap with delicate fingers. Inside was a single handwritten note and a photograph, a different one. It showed Cordelia years younger in the same Greek chapel from the earlier image. But beside her stood a man Miss Marple didn't recognize. He was holding something, a curved blade, weather-worn and ceremonial. At his hip was a pouch, the edge of a sapphire just visible through the clasp. The note read, "If I die, it's because someone thinks I still have the Kalos stone." But the truth is simpler. I lied. Elias never dropped it into the sea. I asked him to say he had. I hid it myself, not for the money, but because it was mine. I earned it. Let the sea have it now for real. Miss Marple read the final line twice. And if you're reading this, Elias, I was right. Someone never stopped looking. That afternoon, as the Celestia Blue prepared to depart from Santorini, the ship's crew made a quiet announcement. Mr. Thorne was still missing. Guests were asked to report any sightings. A hushed tension returned to the decks like a fog. Miss Marple, however, made her way to the lower-level gallery, the quiet art passage near the boutique. Few passengers ventured there, especially in the late hours. But it was there, tucked between two abstract oil paintings, that she found the clue she'd sensed was waiting. A smear. A faint, salty streak on the gallery floor, barely noticeable. Just beneath a ventilation grate. She knelt down, removed a hairpin from her bag, and pried open the cover. Inside, nestled awkwardly within the narrow duct, was a torn piece of shirt fabric, and a cufflink engraved with the initials H.W. Henry Wexley. Mr. Thorne? He had not left the ship. He had been hidden inside it. Miss Marple presented the discovery to Captain Rossetti that evening, in the privacy of his office. He listened with growing disbelief. "We searched every accessible corner," he said. "But no one considered the ventilation ducts." "No one except someone desperate to vanish," Miss Marple replied. Perhaps after seeing Cordelia dead, Thorne feared he'd be next. Or perhaps he was injured. There's blood on the fabric. I believe he's wounded. Possibly trapped. Rossetti pressed the intercom. "I want a search of all lower deck access ducts immediately. Bring thermal scanners, and discreetly, please." He turned to her with a deep, admiring breath. "Miss Marple, may I say, if ever I commit a crime, I hope you are not aboard." She gave a modest smile. "Captain, if you were to commit a crime, I dare say I'd be aboard precisely for that reason." By nightfall, the crew found him. Mr. Thorne, Henry Wexley, was discovered curled inside a service duct near the engine room, weak from blood loss. He had been stabbed just beneath the ribs. He was barely conscious when they lifted him out. Miss Marple waited outside the infirmary while the doctor tended to him. When allowed inside, she approached his bedside quietly. His eyes fluttered open. "You're safe now, Mr. Wexley," she said. His voice was a rasp. "I didn't kill her." "I know." "She told me she had it. She said she buried it. I wanted to know where, that's all." "Who stabbed you?" He coughed, then whispered, "Wasn't a he." Miss Marple leaned closer. She had the canary. Back in her cabin, Miss Marple placed the final notes side by side. The script was consistent, neat, slanting slightly to the left. And then she examined the post-it from the library again. It had one peculiar trait. A tiny smear of sunflower seed dust in the corner. Miss Marple folded her hands. The next morning, when Mrs. Fillmore failed to appear for breakfast, and her cabin was found empty, with the canary cage wide open, Miss Marple was not surprised. The final act, she knew, was already underway. Chapter 6. A Voice Beneath the Waves. The morning sun cast long golden beams across the polished deck of the Celestia Blue, but beneath the soft murmur of breakfast service and the clink of cutlery, the ship vibrated with tension. Mrs. Fillmore was missing. The canary cage in her stateroom had been found empty, its door hanging open like a mouth caught mid-sentence. A scarf had been hastily knotted over the dressing table chair, and a single feather, bright yellow, had been tucked inside the water jug on the bedside table. Captain Rossetti had ordered a discreet but thorough search of the ship. It yielded nothing. But Miss Marple wasn't searching for Mrs. Fillmore. She was waiting for her. At 10:30, Miss Marple took her tea alone on the stern promenade, where the ship curved inward like the tail of a scroll. The breeze was sharper here, and the noise from the upper decks muffled. A single crewman was visible at the far railing, adjusting a life preserver. Otherwise, the deck was empty. Miss Marple sipped her tea, then gently folded her hands in her lap. She didn't look around when a shadow appeared beside her. "Would you like to sit down, Mrs. Fillmore?" There was a long pause. Then the widow's voice came, thin, shaken. "How did you know I'd come here?" "Because you haven't left the ship, and because guilt always prefers quiet corners." Mrs. Fillmore sat, her posture stiff, her hands trembling slightly. She was no longer the flustered woman of sun hats and pearls. Her makeup was gone. Her eyes were hollowed. "I didn't mean for any of it to happen," she said. "I believe you," Miss Marple replied, "but you must tell me everything before someone else decides to finish what they began." Mrs. Fillmore looked out at the water. "I was on that dig in 1991, not as a sponsor, not as a scholar. I was just there. Cordelia had brought me along as her assistant. I cleaned tools, boiled water, took photographs." "But you saw what happened," Miss Marple said. She nodded. "Cordelia found the Kalos stone. No one else knew at first, not even Elias. She kept it quiet for 2 days. Then Thorne, Henry, saw it in her satchel. He tried to take it. They fought. Brooke intervened. There was shouting, then silence. The next day, Elias told everyone he'd thrown the stone into the sea. But I knew better." "Because Cordelia told you the truth?" Mrs. Fillmore's voice lowered. "She said she buried it beneath the chapel, wrapped in a scarf, said it was hers by right. She was proud, ruthless even. But she didn't want it sold. She wanted it remembered, as a symbol, a token of what she'd discovered." Miss Marple waited. The sea hissed against the hull. "And then?" she asked, gently. "Years passed," Mrs. Fillmore said. "Cordelia became famous. Elias kept to his books. Thorne vanished, and I kept the secret. But when I heard about this cruise, when I saw they were all booked on it, I felt something cold settle in my chest. I knew it wasn't coincidence. Cordelia was stirring something up again." "And she wore a replica stone to provoke someone?" "Yes," said Mrs. Fillmore, "to draw them out, maybe to test their memory, maybe just to prove she still held the power." "But the notes?" Miss Marple asked. "The anonymous messages?" "I wrote them," she whispered. "Not to mislead, to warn. I didn't know who to trust. I thought, maybe Elias, maybe Thorne, maybe even the captain." "And when Thorne was stabbed?" Mrs. Fillmore swallowed. "I saw someone outside Cordelia's cabin the night she died. A man in uniform. Could have been a steward. Could have been anyone. I followed him down to the crew corridor, but then he turned and I ran. I dropped the ring I'd kept from the dig site, that old marker. I should have given it back long ago." Miss Marple studied her. "You thought the ring might be a sign that you were next." Mrs. Fillmore nodded. "And when Cordelia died, I knew it wasn't just history. Someone wanted to erase what happened in 1991. Later that day, Captain Rossetti convened a private meeting in the forward lounge. Just Miss Marple, Dr. Brooke, Raymond West, and a groggy but recovering Mr. Thorne. Outside the windows, white cliffs rose in the distance. Crete. "I believe," Miss Marple said, "that the murder of Cordelia Vane was not about the sapphire. It was about pride, fear, and silence. The stone was only ever a symbol." Dr. Brooke looked weary. "Then who—" Miss Marple turned to the captain. "You had a steward dismissed 2 months ago, didn't you, for misconduct? I checked with the purser. His name was Angelos Metaxas." Rossetti stiffened. "Yes, for theft. He stole jewellery from 2 guests on the Adriatic route." Miss Marple continued. "He wasn't removed from the ship, was he? He escaped before you reached port." "We assumed he'd disembarked with the others." "You were wrong," she said calmly. "I believe he never left. I believe he stowed away in the lower levels. I believe he followed the guest manifest. He saw Cordelia's name. He remembered the legend of the Kalos stone, and he killed her." "Why?" Raymond asked quietly. "Because in 1991 he was a local boy near the chapel. He watched the excavation. He saw the stone uncovered, then vanish. Maybe he thought Cordelia took it. Maybe he thought she owed him. And when she showed up wearing a replica, he decided to take back what he believed was his." Dr. Brooke exhaled. "That would explain the uniform, the familiarity with the ship." Rossetti stood. "I'll alert security. We'll check every crawl space, boiler shaft, and pantry." Miss Marple nodded. "And check the old ventilation access near the captain's quarters. That's where he's been hiding." By sundown, Angelos Metaxas was caught. He had been living between deck layers, stealing food, moving only at night. In his pocket was a photo of Cordelia from the 1991 dig, torn down the center. And a replica sapphire, one he'd taken from her body after the murder, convinced it was real. He confessed everything. Cordelia had laughed at him when he'd confronted her. And so he had pushed her. The next morning, as the Celestia Blue sailed into Heraklion Harbour, the wind was warm and the sun steady. Miss Marple stood on the observation deck, watching the port inch closer. Raymond came to stand beside her. "You were right," he said. "Again?" Miss Marple smiled softly. "It's never about what people say, dear. It's about what they keep." "And the real sapphire?" "Still buried under the chapel, I imagine." "As it should be." Raymond exhaled. "What now?" Miss Marple looked toward the sea. "We go ashore, have tea, and try, if we can, to enjoy the rest of the journey, while the sea remains calm." Chapter 7. The Last Letter. 3 days later, the Celestia Blue docked in its final port, Lisbon. Morning mist rolled in low across the harbour, softening the skyline to a watercolour blur. Passengers began to disembark in gentle trickles, trolleys creaking, porters hailing taxis, and the brass band returning with half-hearted cheer. Yet for Miss Marple, there was no great rush. She stood on the upper deck in her dove-grey travelling coat, gazing down at the receding gangplank, her thoughts lingering not on what had just ended, but on what had been long buried. Behind her, Raymond emerged, notebook under his arm. "I rather think I might set my next novel on a ship," he said. "Or perhaps not. Feels almost greedy after what you've solved." Miss Marple gave him a faint smile. "Just remember, dear, it's rarely the storm you see coming that sinks the ship. It's the rot no one checks for." Raymond chuckled. "If you were anyone else, that would sound rather poetic." Later that morning, Miss Marple returned to her stateroom for one final inspection. Everything was in order, gloves, handkerchiefs, her embroidery kit neatly repacked. Yet as she turned to leave, she noticed an envelope on her pillow, unmarked, ivory-coloured, no name. Inside was a letter. The handwriting was unfamiliar, elegant, looping, unmistakably feminine. "Miss Marple, you were right, of course, about everything. I knew in the end someone would come for Cordelia. I only regret that I wasn't brave enough to warn her properly. I wrote those notes, hoping you'd piece it together. You did more than that. You gave her dignity. The chapel still stands. The stone is still there. No one will find it now, not unless they deserve to. Cordelia would have liked that. Thank you. Yours in silence, a fellow passenger. There was no signature, no identifying marks, but Miss Marple didn't need one. She tucked the letter into her handbag beside her glasses. Outside, the Lisbon sunlight broke through the mist, casting a clear beam across the deck. Crewmen saluted. The air smelled faintly of oranges and seawater. Somewhere behind her, a violinist played something soft and wistful. As the last call echoed across the ship, Miss Marple stepped to shore, her suitcase wheeled gently behind her. Epilogue. 2 weeks later, in St. Mary Mead, a small brown package arrived at the vicarage for Miss Marple. Inside was a framed photograph, weathered black and white, of a whitewashed chapel under the Greek sun. 6 people stood before it, squinting into the light. Cordelia's smile, wide and knowing, Dr. Brooks' distracted posture, Mr. Thorne's wary stance, and at the very edge, almost hidden behind an olive tree, Mrs. Fillmore. Miss Marple placed the frame by the window beside her geraniums. She watched the wind shift their petals, a breeze whispering through the lace curtains. She sipped her tea and said very quietly to herself, "The sea never forgets." Chapter 8. Ashes of the Aegean One. Month later, the white chapel at Kalos Limena stood empty beneath the blazing Greek sun. Time had worn the building thin, its paint faded, the roofline beginning to bow under the weight of salt and seasons. Only the buzz of insects and the distant murmur of waves kept it company. From the hillside above, a path twisted between fig trees and broken stone steps, leading down toward the sea where the ruins of the old dig still lay, buried beneath dust and silence. A lone figure in linen, sun hat pulled low, moved slowly down that path. Miss Marple had come as quietly as she had once left, clutching a letter from the Greek Archaeological Board, granting her permission to visit the site as a private researcher with historic connection. She had no shovel, no interest in disturbing what had already caused enough grief, but she did have a small pouch embroidered old and a purpose. At the base of the chapel wall, beneath the shade of an ancient olive tree, she paused. There, beside a shallow recess in the earth, she knelt and placed the pouch down gently. Within it were ashes, Cordelia Vane's personal effects, what few had not been claimed, a single earring, a photograph, a charm from the replica sapphire necklace, a note she had once written to herself, unsigned, but bold. If truth cannot be worn, let it be buried, but not forgotten. Miss Marple added a sprig of thyme. Then, with care, she covered it with soil and patted it down with her gloved hands. She stayed at a modest guest house that evening, in a room with blue shutters and no locks on the door. The sea whispered just beyond the cliffs. That night, she wrote a letter to Raymond. "Dearest Raymond, you'll be pleased to know I've finally made it to Kalos Limenas. I didn't dig for treasure, nor did I uncover any gods of the sea, but I did put a few things back where they belonged. Cordelia Vane was many things, reckless, proud, captivating, but not undeserving of rest. There are places that remember us even when people don't. This is one of them. Give my love to the garden, and keep your mystery novels short. I do tire of long-winded detectives. Yours, as always, Aunt Jane." She sealed the envelope, placed it by the bed, and let the breeze lull her to sleep. Back in St. Mary Mead, autumn leaves rustled outside her cottage. The vicar's cat had taken to napping on her windowsill, and the grocer's daughter had begun learning to ride a bicycle noisily down the lane. Normal life had returned,